Hello everyone. I once got a comment on YouTube that one of our trains was disappearing off into the distance. It was pulling coaches and the red tail lights on the locomotive were on. And someone commented and said, "That's not very prototypical." And I thought, hell, he's right. Here's how we fixed it. So this is a lockdown shaggy dog story. It grew arms and legs. What happened? The origins of this were we needed to put lights in some of our locomotives. The Bachmann Class 20s specifically, up till very recently, didn't have fitted factory lights. And so Ian said, well, we need lights in the engines. Yeah, I get that. We want to have lights on our diesels. It looks right. So I contacted Jason Edmonds, who is, I think, Stick Swipe on eBay. And we ordered some of the lighting kits from him. And it was a lockdown special. Pete wanted something to do at home. So we ordered 10 or 15 of those sets, put the engines in a box, delivered them at super arm's length. You know how all fearful we all were about giving each other this horrible virus? So Pete took these things away, took Jason's lighting kits in, modified the engines, gave the engines to Ian to program, and then Ian, over YouTube to me, showed me what he'd done. So this was really clever because we had the headlights on at each end, the tail lights weren't on, but if you pressed, and the headlights would work appropriately, and if he pressed F8, the tail lights would come on at the appropriate end as the engine was going along. So that solved that YouTube comment. I thought, that's fantastic. Then Ian went one better and he said, and guess what? If you turn the headlights F0 off and leave the tail lights F8 on, that's how we program here, both tail lights go on as if the engine is parked up in the shed. And if it had cab lights as well, he said I could have them on as well, so it could look a real sort of scene. I said, oh Ian, I'm sold on that. So we thought, why don't we have a go on all our other locomotives that do have lights and make adaptations? The problem was we hadn't really thought, well, lockdown was in full flight, and I've got my little list of how many blooming engines we ended up having to modify because we didn't really think about the consequences. There were 23 Helgen locomotives, that's manageable. There were 140 Bachmann locomotives, excluding the Class 20s that we had to modify. And then there were the Hornby Class 31s. There's a special story there. So the Helgen locomotives, pretty much all of those are 8-pin models. They're relatively straightforward to modify, and we'll show you an as-built one where we did the adaptation. And something to just quickly explain is this. If you want to put taillights onto a locomotive and you've got the headlights working, you need to use AUX1 and AUX2. If it's got cab lights fitted, you need AUX1 for the cab lights typically, and then you're going to use AUX2 and AUX3. And there's a complication as soon as you go to AUX3 or AUX4 on the standard DCC chip logic as defined by the NMRA, which is that AUX1 and AUX2 work in the same way as the headlights, the yellow and the white wires. You're pulling the voltage to 0, but the AUX3 and AUX4 don't work like that. They are logic gates and they go +5. Now, here, and you'll see these in detail in a minute, ESU, luckily, these clever guys, these Germans, aren't they? They have the standard NMRA, Lock Pilot and LoKsound, but they also have a German version, which is called the MKL, where AUX3 and AUX4 work in exactly the same electrical way as AUX1 and AUX2, so you can drag down to ground. So we ended up getting some of these versions where we drag it to ground for the locomotives that had the 2 switches at the bottom, but I'll come to those in just a second. So there are 2 kinds of DCC chips you might have to use. With the Bachmann models, pretty much most of them, and there were a shed load of these. I've got the numbers here somewhere. I think it was something like about 40 Class 24 and 25s. There were 26 Class 37s like this. There were 36 47s, there were 15 peaks, and about 17 Class 40s. The Bachmann models, I talked about the 2 and 1 switch versions. You'll see Pete doing the modifications to one of these, to both these kinds actually. This is a 2 switch one, so our modifications for a 2 switch locomotive require the MKL version of the DCC chip, i.e. the German version I've just described. Finally, The other problem I need to just share with you is the Hornby 31s. Well, Hornby 31s are like hen's teeth, ignoring the early ones, which have got all the Madsack problems. The real challenge with the Hornby locos is they paint their PCBs. They cover them in matte black, and they're overly complicated. Well, we ended up just ripping the PCBs out, which is way beyond what most people want, but I wasn't going to give up on the 31s and have everything else behaving on this railway except all the flipping Hornbys. And so we got these are Lace DCC 21 pin adapter boards, and there's a little outfit called CM3 models, which every time I've ordered from him, these things fly in within 2 days. So these boards, which Pete will show you on the desk in more detail, allow you to put a standard NMRA compliant chip into a locomotive, and it will do the adaptation of the logic for these two things, for AUX 3 and AUX 4, so you haven't got to have all those custom chips. The last manufacturer I haven't mentioned up to now is Dapol. All their most recent models are completely on a different league to everybody else. So their recent 52s, the 22s, the DMUs, the bubble car, all those, they're already wired up to do all this smart lighting. So suddenly you don't have to do it, but they're the only manufacturer, except actually Bachmann with their 24 ones. That very new variant of the Class 24 works. So Dapol have got it cracked, and you haven't got to go through the madness we've done, and Bachmann are catching up. I don't know where Hornby are. So let's go and have a look at the detail with Pete. Thanks.
So this is what started the journey with the 20s. And now I will just take the top off. When I first had this 20, it had no lights in it at all. So you could get these light kits, which is from Jasing Lights, which is something like this, that comes in a bag with all your bits and pieces. Obviously this is for a 45, but I don't have any 20s left at the moment. And basically you get a little circuit board, but before you can put this little circuit board in, you have to drill a little hole in the lights with a very fine drill, and then you get a piece of fibre optic which you have to push through, glue in place, and then just trim it off with a pair of cutters. You also have to remove the glass here and then drill holes and clean it out with a knife, so that you could then have it so that the light shines through this bit. Once you've done that, the next job is your little board will just drop into place. Now the best thing I find is use a little bit of black tack. If you haven't got black tack, blue tack will do. Put a little dob in the middle, and then you will have to, I use a little 9-volt battery just to power up the LEDs, and then you will have to look at the front, and then you have to move the board around inside so you get the lights showing. Once you've done that, then I use a little bit of super glue in each corner just to hold it, and then check again, because if it moves slightly, the lights won't work properly. Once you're happy with it, then I just put a bit more glue, and basically that's that one finished. The cab end down here, you take the cab off, and then again you have to drill holes and then put the piece of glass in, and then they give you a small circuit board that will fit down here. You have to do the same again and drill the front of these little lights out, and then put fibre optic in, trim them, put the lights, and the same thing again. Use a little 9-volt battery just to power it up so that you can just check to make sure that they look okay. Once you've done that, you then connect it to your board. So I soldered the wires onto the PCB board, and I will just take this off, and basically you have to solder the yellow wire to pin 7 and the white wire to pin 8.
The Jason lighting kit for the Class 20s includes lights for the head and tail lights at the number 1 end, head and tail lights for the number 2 end, and also cab lighting at the number 2 end. This means in total there are 8 wires. Of those 8, the 3 blue wires, which is for the number 2 end, for the cab lights and for the number 1 end, those 3 blue wires are the positive common, which is connected to pin 16 in there, the blue wire there. Pete has wired up the green wire, which is the return lead for the cab lighting, to aux 1 here. The complicated part for a lot of us is the fact that the same colour wires are used for different reasons at both ends. So the number 1 end, this is this end here, the white wire lights the headlights, and at the number 2 end, the white wire lights the tail lights. So the white lights from the tail lights here has to go down to one of these aux wires, as does the yellow wire from the number 1 end, which goes to the aux lights. And you can see down here, we have the blue, we have the cab light in green, we have the number 1 end tail lights going to aux 2, and the number 2 end tail lights, which relate to white, is on aux 3. The headlights at the number 1 end are on the white wire, and that comes through to pin 8. And the yellow wire here from the tail end is actually the headlights for the number 2 end. So all in all, there are 8 wires. 3 of them are common, which is the blue, and all the others have to be connected either to F0 yellow and white, which is pins 7 and 8, and then the aux wires 15, 14 and 13, which is aux 1, aux 2 and aux 3 respectively. Because we're now using 3 aux wires on this engine, we have to use that MKL variant of the ESU chip, because we're using 3 auxiliary wires that are all pulled to ground, rather than using the floating logic that was required for aux 3. So the Class 20 is a slightly more complicated model than we would have first thought about. Here is the Class 20 on the lock programming track. You can see that if I turn the headlights on, the head code box on the cab turns on at this end, and there are no tail lights at the other end. If I swap direction, the head code box goes off at this end, and at the far end, the head code box lights up. If I bring it back to this end, and I now put on the tail lights in addition, you will see the 2 red lights at the far end. And if I change direction again, you will see that they're flipping around as you would expect on a conventional model that's been supplied by Bachmann or Hornby. If we then turn the headlights, the head code boxes off, turn F0 off and leave F8 on, you can see that both sets of tail lights have been lit, and in addition the cab light comes on. And if I turn F8 off, you will see that all lights go off. Ian will explain how you do this in the lock programmer section at the back end of the modifications to the Class 47 that Pete will show you now.
Well, here we are with a 47, which I'm going to modify so it's got independent tail lights, and it's the 47 from Bachmann. So the first thing I'm going to do is take off the 21 pin chip and put to one side. Then the next thing I'd like to do is get rid of these horrible plastic press-on stud things that hold the wire in place, because you can't beat a bit of solder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just solder them as I go along. That one's done. I do one at a time, just in case you go and decide to take them all off and then the wire comes off and you're thinking, where did it go? And I'm going to do that on all of the, get rid of these horrible plastic thing. Sometimes you have to use tweezers just to pop them off. And then we just got one more to go. Sometimes you have to just lift the wire up a bit so that you've got a bit of wire to be able to solder. So you get a solder joint. So on the board you've got the wire going to A. So what you need to do is disconnect it from the pad, put a little extension wire on with a bit of heat sleeving so that you can stretch it from there across to pin 14. Then again on the other side you go to A, disconnect the wire, put a little piece of wire on with heat sleeving, and then cut a piece of wire so it reaches across to pin 15 and solder. So here's the orange wire at the A end, and what you need to do, now I normally just do this, I don't bother unsoldering it, I just wriggle the wire and it normally comes off right. Once you've got that wire off, and then I then just clean that up. I will now just tin it. Get a little, and then you just get yourself a little length of orange wire. Cut it. And then I'm just going to solder that on. Right, okay. Then you get a little bit of sleeving. Just push it over the thing. And I normally just use the soldering iron just to quickly put the old sleeving on. Just make sure it doesn't move. Once you've done that, that wire is now ready to come across to go onto one of your pins. Now, because this is A end, this will go to aux, I'll just check, aux 1, which aux 1 is pin 15. Right, and then I normally just check to make sure that I got it on there. Little tug just to check, and then that's that one. Now we come over to the other end, which is the B end. You get your little orange wire, break it away from the board, and then again sometimes just trim it off. So you've got tin the wire. So we now need to solder this wire onto pin number 14. So we just need to check to get it roughly about the right length. Now this has to go onto pin, so you have to make sure you don't catch the other one that you've just soldered. Right. And then again, just a little tug on it, make sure. Sometimes I get the tweezers and just one between the little pins, and then that way you know that there isn't anything bridging it. We now need to fit the chip back. So we now just put the chip back into place. Always go careful when you're putting these on because it's very easy to bend the pins. And that's it. It's all now done and ready for testing. Okay, so we now need to pop the cover on and test it. But before you do put the cover on, make sure that you've got no wires in the way. Once you check that the wiring's all right, and make sure you put it the right way round. And that's it. The body's back on, and then obviously put the screws back in it and it's ready for, but before putting the screws back in it, it's normally pays to just test it to make sure it's okay. Otherwise you've got to undo it all and take it apart again. One last thing, what we need to do is, because of the modifications that we've done to the Loco, we need to just make sure that the switch is left on the on position.
Now that we've done the lighting mods, we can bring it up onto the programming track and just give it a test over and make sure it's actually working. If I turn the track power on, and then if I put the lights on, so we get the headlights at this end, at number 1 end, and then headlights at number 2 end without the tail lamps note. So then if we put the tail lights on as well, we get tail lights at that end, and then swap them over. But if we now turn the tail lights off, we should end up with tail lights at both ends. With most decoders, you'll be forced to put the headlight and the tail light on different functions. So you might have to put number 1 headlight on, sorry, number 1 tail light on, say, function 4, and the number 2 tail light on function 5. But because we're using ESU LockSound and LockPilot chips, we can leverage the power of the chip, because with a LockSound, you'll not only be able to turn a function on with a function button, but you can also arrange it so that another function can also override it and turn it off. So on these, on our setup, when we've only got the headlight on, we just F0, but we haven't got F8 turned on. We only get the headlight or the headlights at either one end or the other. It's only when we put on the F8 do we actually get the headlight and the tail light at the opposite end. But if we turn the headlight off and only have the tail light on, we get the tail lights at both ends. So this is useful when it's parked up in a carriage siding, in the Loco sidings. Well, also with Locos that are fitted with cab lighting, we also put the cab lights on as well at that point, and it just shows them off.